Hello. Hello, bonjour. My name is Megan Ho, and on behalf of the Ottawa Art Gallery, I would like to welcome you and thank you for joining us this afternoon for our program Art and Tea at the OAG. Today, we are thrilled to mark 3 exciting exhibition cycles. The closing of our exhibition, A Family Palette, Frances-Anne Johnston, Franklin Arbuckle, and Franz Johnston, and to celebrate the opening of 2 new exhibitions, Wilfrid Flood, A Passion for Pictures, and Reference Point, Recent Historical Acquisitions. Before I go further, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that the Ottawa Art Gallery operates on the beautiful Anishinaabe Aki. The Anishinaabe have been on this territory, known today as the City of Ottawa, since the beginning of time. All sorts of art forms have been, continue, and will continue to be part of the vibrant Anishinaabe culture. This afternoon's program will begin with opening remarks by OAG Director and CEO Alexandra Badzak, followed by a presentation on the art and life of Frances-Anne Johnston by OAG Curator Rebecca Basciano. This presentation will last for approximately 30 minutes, followed by a Q&A period. Please note that the presentation portion of the talk held in this room will be recorded, where it will be kept for future access. I encourage you to make yourself comfortable, and of course, please help yourself to tea and refreshments, which can be found on each table, with refills at the back of the room. I also just want to take a moment to thank our core funders, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Ontario Arts Council, and the City of Ottawa for support of programs like these. Thank you again for joining us, and now I am pleased to welcome the Director and CEO of the Ottawa Art Gallery, Alexandra Badzak.
Merci Megan. Bonjour, bienvenue. Au nom de la Galerie d'Art d'Ottawa, merci beaucoup à tous d'être venus aujourd'hui. Thanks everyone for joining us for our annual Firestone Chat, Art and Tea at the OAG, a reference, of course, to the Firestone collection of Canadian art, which was originally donated by the Firestone family, of which the OAG are stewards, and which over the years has given us, and really decades to be honest, provided us with many inspiring exhibitions and stories to tell. So, c'est une belle journée d'hiver, mais aujourd'hui, nous avons de thé et l'art pour vous. So please sit back, enjoy today. Feel free to flow back to get yourself more tea. We're going to take this very casually. So as Megan mentioned, we're opening 2 new exhibitions today in the Firestone Gallery, and I want to tell you a little bit more about them. Wilfrid Flood, A Passion for Pictures, is a special focus on the short but really extraordinary life of an Ottawa painter, Wilfrid Flood. His sensitive renderings of everyday life during a really seminal period in Ottawa encourages us to slow down a bit and view our environment in a different way. And so for this exhibition, we drew on a fairly major donation by the family in 2016, primarily coming from Frances Flood, the daughter of Wilfrid. And the exhibition presents a selection of the artist's work from the early 1930s up until the time of his death in 1946. Again, I want to thank Frances Flood for this amazing, the estate of Frances Flood for the amazing donation, and of course must mention Wilfrid Flood's son, John, who couldn't be with us today, but was so seminal in getting us that donation for his ongoing archival work and family research, which really has allowed us to share the extraordinary life of this amazing Ottawa artist with all of you. And I'm pleased to say that we do have Wilfrid Flood's granddaughter with us in the crowd today, so thank you for coming out. On the other side of the Firestone Gallery, in celebration of the OAG's 5th anniversary in this building, and can you believe it's 5 years already, as well as our 35th anniversary, yay, we're here. It's also our 35th anniversary as an organization. Our second Firestone exhibition, entitled Reference Point, Recent Historical Acquisitions, features a selection of recent historical artwork that we recently brought into our collection. And so for a little background, in the first period of OAG's history, we were primarily collecting contemporary work, almost exclusively so. And then in the last few years, we've been able to draw in some historical work into our collection. And these works from artists and collectors with connections to the region really help us to, again, widen that story of our community's evolution as told through art. And again, I want to thank the amazing artists and donors who are listed in this slide, many who could join us today for these incredible historical works. And I also want to give a big thanks and acknowledge the curator of these two exhibitions, Megan Ho, who joined us today earlier on the stage. And speaking of exhibitions and the Firestone collection, the final exhibition that I want to talk about, as Megan mentioned, is A Family Palette, an exhibition that started a few years ago with one work by Frances-Anne Johnston, donated by our friend Brenda Firestone. And that started a journey for the gallery and curator Rebecca Basciano, and that journey led us to an exploration and a celebration of an amazing artist family. And through the exhibition and the upcoming tour and the publication, we address a gap in the Canadian art historical canon by placing Frances-Anne Johnston firmly within it. And to tell us more about that journey and more about the remarkable Frances-Anne Johnston, it is my pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker today. Rebecca Basciano is MA, I should say, is a curator at the Ottawa Art Gallery, which she specializes in Canadian art. She has a demonstrated interest in promoting the work of women artists, while also advocating for consistent representation. Her in-depth and primary research on Frances-Anne Johnston marks an important continuation of this dialogue. Please help me to welcome Rebecca Basciano.
Hello, everyone. So really excited to be here today to talk to you about the art and life of Frances-Anne Johnston within the context of the exhibition, A Family Palette. So here she is. I consider Johnston as one of Canada's foremost painters of still lifes, flowers, and interiors. However, as a woman working within a patriarchal society, her artistic career has not been as well documented as those of her father, Franz Johnston, who was a founding member of the Group of Seven, and then her husband, famed illustrator Franklin Arbuckle. Due to gender, she's been overshadowed in Canadian art history and is relatively unknown. As such, over the past several years, it's become my passion project to recover her story. So, as Alex mentioned, it all began with a historical acquisition to our collection in 2015 from Brenda Firestone of these works here. While OAG holds over 1,600 works from this very important family of collectors, known as the Firestone Collection of Canadian Art, these particular pieces were from Isabel Firestone's private collection. So I love that a woman collector in Ottawa was paying attention to another woman's practice, Frances-Anne, and then her daughter, it's because of her daughter, Brenda, that they are available to us today. So when they were presented to us at the OEG, our curatorial team didn't really know anything about her. When we have to do these justifications, of course, for everything that comes in, so we started doing research. And after some research, we realized there's actually not much out there. So I decided to reach out to her family, and I first connected with Robin, one of Johnston's daughters. And through her, I was acquainted with the context of Johnston's extensive and impressive practice. My inner art detective, by the way, if art detective was a job, that would be my job. I love it. But my inner art detective was inspired to undertake this large feminist recovery project, diving through primary material in the libraries and archives and bringing to light this unrepresented story. So with connections to Franz Johnston and Franklin Arbuckle, as I said, Frances-Anne Johnston was often branded as the artist's daughter or the artist's wife. She recalled their frequent remark, "Oh, you're Franz Johnston's daughter. No wonder you can paint." And she responded, as if knowledge of painting could be inherited like blue eyes or dimples. With this remark, I think she wanted people to know that she worked very hard and was very passionate about her artistic practice. And I think this quote pairs really well with one of my favorite photographs of her. She was bold and she was playful, which, as you'll see, is also reflected in her artwork. So as a child, Frances-Anne Johnston learned to paint and sketch and was fueled by interactions with visiting artists, constantly traveling, and a household animated by stimulating conversation. Here she is at 10 years old, and this is a really beautiful, intimate portrait done by her father by lamplight. So at the age of 17, she made the conscious decision to pursue an artistic career, and she got a scholarship to attend the Ontario College of Art in Toronto. And you can see, I can't believe we were able to find this, but we still have her student card from the Ontario College of Art here. And she did some still life classes. So she shows early interest and skill in still life, and this is her portfolio from second year. Now these are good, they're not great, but she's a student. And I think this also goes with the quote that I was talking to you about before. She worked really hard. It wasn't just she was born with it. She worked really hard and she learned a lot in art school and continued to learn throughout her whole life. She also attended the school's outdoor summer program, which took place at Molson Mill in Port Hope. And it was here that she met fellow art student Franklin Arbuckle, whom she married. And here are they, they're on their marriage day, here they are. In fact, years later, Arbuckle went back to paint the Port Hope Summer School where he had proposed to Frances-Anne. You'll see this upstairs in the exhibition. Shortly after graduating art school, Johnston participated in her first of many exhibitions showcasing this particular work. This early landscape captures the subtle and ambient movement of light and shadow amongst the trees, and it's very different from the bold still lifes that she starts to do shortly after. And this aesthetic is very similar in style to her father and that of the Group of Seven, especially when you see these two compared side by side. And it's not surprising considering that J.H. MacDonald and a lot of those men painting in this fashion were her teachers at art school. While Johnston began her professional career with a view of becoming a landscape painter, after the birth of her first child, she realized it was not easy to make sketching trips while raising a family. She was quoted as saying, "I'll never forget the first day I thought it was time I stayed home. Archie left for the studio by himself, and I sat looking at the walls and the Chesterfield and the aspidistras, and I thought, what am I doing here?" I had to look up how to say aspidistras, which is so her. She had gardens, she knew her flowers and plants and all of that, and so I love this quote, especially because this is what she starts painting, what she's looking at when she's sitting at home. So yes, instead of landscape, she turned her attention to interiors and domestic subjects instead, and developed an aesthetic style that started to be very distinct from both her father and her husband. So Johnston found a way to balance the role of professional artists with the conventional responsibilities of housekeeping and motherhood. In 1959, she stated, "I've got an easel now. For years, I painted on 2 chairs spread with newspaper at night." So after the children have gone to bed. So this improvised way of working, when I was talking to her daughter Robin, she remembers it because she would come home from school on school days for lunch, and she'd see her mother clearing the table of a still life, serve her lunch, and then she would go back to school. So this is sort of the way that she was working at home, makeshift however she could, quick setups and takedowns. She started painting interiors and still lifes with confidence, which is evident in this early and often exhibited work. There's something very intimate and crowded here. All of her interiors, even her still lifes, very crowded. And the darkness of the palette reflects a typically somber Victorian space, the only source of light streaming through a barrier of plants at the window. So this is the home, actually, it's not her home, but it is the home of her neighbor, Mrs. R.J. Merker, who was another notable woman who contributed to Johnston's story. So Mrs. Merker was actually an interior designer from the United States, and when she passed away, she left objects to Frances-Anne Johnston. One of these was a wooden Madonna figure seen in the top left corner of this work, which Johnston subsequently included in a number of her paintings. So Johnston and her husband Franklin Arbuckle were known to have surrounded themselves with unique objects, antiques, beautiful handcrafted furniture, and their home displayed their personal collection. The whole family was involved in the decorative arts. Arbuckle was known to have carved his own frames and to have made the occasional piece of furniture. Johnston's grandfather, Franz Johnston, actually painted the interiors of Victorian homes in Toronto, and her father followed in his footsteps, painting interior mural decorations in all of their family homes. And I was able to bring one of them into the gallery space, because most of these murals are lost. But this one here is on loan from the McMichael Canadian Art Collection. They once hung in Franz Johnston's cottage and surrounding the fireplace, and they've never been seen by the public before. They were conserved and restored specifically for the purposes of this exhibition. So he painted all of their homes, so Frances-Anne would have grown up with this around her. He was even known to have gone into other people's homes and to like paint a door or leave his mark. But of course, a lot of these are not available anymore. And he also had, for a brief period of time, an antique store. So as a teenager, Frances-Anne Johnston painted ceramics, made batiks, and designed lampshades for the antique store, which was called the Treasure Chest. It was on Yonge Street in Toronto. And upon graduation from art school, Johnston and Arbuckle, they worked in her father's studio for a brief period of time, and they were all making commercial displays for the Canadian National Exhibition and the Eaton's Santa Claus Parade as a few examples. So throughout her life, Johnston continued to enjoy the decorative arts, as evidenced in many of her handmade rugs and pieces of furniture, such as these. In fact, once while she was in the hospital, she asked her daughters, so it was this dresser here, she asked her daughters to bring her drawer by drawer so that she could paint them while she was sitting in her hospital bed. So Arbuckle would also go on to undertake several mural and tapestry commissions during his career. It includes this mural here, which if you were able to catch Erin's spot tuck earlier, she went into it in detail, which was amazing. Thank you so much, Erin. But this was for a rail car, so called the Canadian, and the gray squares are where the windows would have been. And he was sent details on the color scheme and was provided with, furnishing samples so he could create a mural that could complement them. Arbuckle also built their cottage on the grounds of Skittawaboo and Tondakia Lodge. So this was Franz Johnston's summer art school on Georgian Bay, and here's their cottage being built. And during the Depression years of the 1930s, in exchange for room and board, the family taught classes on landscape, still life, design, flower painting, batik, wood carving, and weaving. And here's a brochure for that school, and you can see all their names listed, included Frances-Anne's, as the teachers at that school. So here's their cottage, and here's Arbuckle's painting of it. You can see Frances-Anne Johnston in the bottom left corner holding a flower, and a flower was one of her preferred subjects to paint. So this is a beautiful work. Now, in contrast, here is Johnston's painting of it. So she did this 2 years after the birth of her first child, just to give you some context. And like many of her paintings of interiors, it incorporates this recurring motif of windows and doors, and open windows and doors. And as a critique of the way women artists were relegated to domestic subjects due to sexism and gender bias, this motif is symbolic of freedom and alienation within the genre. So it's also seen in the work of contemporaneous artists to her, like Peggy Nickel McLeod, Christiane Fluke, and this work here by Ghitta Caiserman, which is part of our collection. You can see that open door window is like the central theme. So for this particular work, an earlier sketch here reveals that the dark curtain on the left was a late addition to resolve the composition. So the curtain also adds another layer of space and psychological dimension, making the viewer even further removed from the door to the outside world. And that curtain, by the way, I have it in the exhibition in her studio room. She used it as like carpets, curtains. She like draped it over tables. You know, she used it a lot. So you could see the original upstairs. So Johnston generally became more concerned with depth of space, bold colors, and a formal approach than she was in the impressionist properties of light. So in this work, for instance, the path to the outdoors is obstructed by a cluster of chairs and a second set of doors to the sunroom, and rectangles formally link the interior to the exterior. So as an extension of her work in interiors, Johnston excelled in her depiction of still lives, which are her most exhibited and prolific genre. Similar to her interiors, they incorporate bold colors and are crowded with familiar objects. So her particular favorite objects include a white jug decorated with these black cherries and a pedestal bowl. And you can see them, and there's so many examples, but I just chose a couple. And she paints them over and over and over again in so many different ways. So as noted in an exhibition review, her objects perform like players on a stage. Quote, fruit, flowers, vegetables, and a variety of bowls, vases, and bottles all play their parts, as well as effectively patterned materials, end quote. These paintings are private fictional worlds created entirely from her imagination. Johnston also sets each scene with elaborate backdrops. Her love of material is showcased in this early photographic portrait taken by M.O. Hammond, where she's draped herself in a piece of fabric reminiscent of her backgrounds. Her love of fabric and pattern continued throughout her career, seen almost 40 years later after that portrait was taken, where pieces of fabric are actually pinned along the back wall for inspiration, and including this green and purple plaid piece that can be recognized as the backdrop for her work, Phlox. The entire exhibition is a search and find, by the way. As I was going through all of the works, I kept saying, oh, I know that jug, or, I've seen that piece of fabric somewhere else. So she's really, using what's around her every day in her domestic space and painting them and being creative with them, never getting bored of them. So although these fabrics create a private world that extends to the edges of the frame, it wasn't until I saw this particular work in a private collection that I fully understood it. So here she's sort of showing us the offstage secrets. This aesthetic originated from a lack of studio space. So Frances-Anne would simply drape fabric over chairs and other furniture to paint in her kitchen, living room, garden, upstairs bedroom, and wherever she could. And she frequently returned to a particular piece of fabric, this one here. Her daughter Candace actually bought it home one day, and she was going to make a dress with it, but her mother asked to borrow it and never gave it back. And it's very clear why Johnston liked it so much, because it's very similar to Henri Matisse's cutouts. So it is one of the many visual tells within her oeuvre that speak to her formal influences. Johnston embraced the emotional qualities of intense Fauves colors and was really inspired by Matisse. So other references to Matisse include an illustration of his famous work Dance in this work. And just for fun, I brought in Matisse's version, where he's included his work Dance in his work. And you can see a lot of similarities between this and some of her pieces. And then, as well as in this work, where she's placed the famous first edition of Verve magazine from 1937, and the cover illustration was by Matisse. And so this is her diploma work, which she executed in 1963 and was deposited at the National Gallery of Canada. in recognition of achieving academician status with the Royal Canadian Academy. So her husband had gained this same status 20 years earlier. And I'd like to suggest, because it's not an accident, she's placing things very deliberately. I'd like to suggest that by including this edition of Verve magazine in her painting, she might have been showcasing that she had been an established artist for a very long time, like since the 30s. She's been studying the modern art movement. She has the first edition, and 30 years later, she finally gets the credit that's due to her. But her aesthetic experimentation was not just limited to Fauvism techniques. It also included references to the Dutch Golden Age, Post-Impressionism, and Cubism. Throughout her oeuvre, Johnston's knowledge of the history of still life genre is transformed into something that is feminist and uniquely her own. So in a few works, including this one, a blue and white napkin falls off the edge of her table, projecting out of the picture plane. Popularized in Dutch still life paintings of the 17th century, this artistic trick includes viewers within the depicted space, as seen in this work where the lemon peel and the plate and knife are sort of hanging over the edge of that table there. Also, there's no figures in this work. She never really did figures, but the crumpled napkin and the rumpled pillows are very emblematic of human presence. And if I can bring up another work by a contemporaneous artist, Ghitta Caiserman, rumpled towels here indicate bodily presence, that people are there. Johnston also uses the multi-point perspective developed by Paul Cézanne and the Cubist artists who followed. So in this work, she examines the weight and volume of her objects, rendering them as cylinders and spheres, and the curves rhythmically echo across her canvas, bringing unity to a group depicted from different vantage points. The bunched fabric distorts the table surface and blurs any single point perspective, and is very similar to the work here on the right by Cézanne. In other works, Johnston flattens the picture plane and takes a cubist approach. Tipping the table forward completely, Johnston experimented with the principles of what's called synthetic cubism, verging on the abstract. So compare this work to that of Cubist artist Juan Gris. And books about Juan Gris do appear in some of her other works. So she's clearly studying this particular type of painting. This work also includes collage. So I was actually able to track down the newspaper from the Globe and Mail, and the article references a widespread snowstorm in the Toronto metro area in 1968, which left families housebound and without electricity. My instinct, now I'm just putting this on it, but people left housebound, she knows what that's like. But regardless, if that's what it's about or not, this work, she's contrasting Cubism within her own personal Canadian sphere. So even the pochette, the small stringed instrument, known as a pocket fiddle there, it recurs within her work. It's another Cubist trope. So musical instruments were a central motif to the Cubists, who associated music with the visual rhythm, movement, and time that they aimed to capture in their aesthetic. So the pochette was actually owned by Franklin Arbuckle's father and is reflective of the family's love of music. So Johnston's mother, Florence Jameson Johnston, was a qualified music teacher, and Johnston herself, as you can see in this photograph here, played the piano quite well. While in Montreal, Johnston and Arbuckle would have company over, including the director of the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, and they'd have everyone gather around the piano and they would sing English folk songs. And coincidentally, Franz Johnston actually illustrated a book of folk songs, which is also in the exhibition. So yet again, this illustrates how Johnston was able to apply formalist experiments to her treasured objects, directing them in a narrative that reads both skillfully but also autobiographically. So as a sub-theme of the still life genre, flowers were also very central to Johnston's oeuvre. A reviewer once noted, quote, "Flowers she understands as though she's invented them," end quote. Johnston gardened throughout her life and was always bringing flowers into the house. When she was younger, her father moved the family to various retreats for his painting, including J.H. MacDonald's house in Thornhill, where they cleaned up the famous Tangled Garden, if you know this very famous work. So yes, they did clean it up and tended to the apple orchard there, and that was sort of formative in her life, and she started sketching there. And years later, she executed this work, which seems to be her feminist response to the original Tangled Garden by MacDonald, who was a close family friend and one of her teachers in art school. As a gardener, Johnston portrayed a variety of flowers from all seasons, often incorporating their specific names into the titles of her works. Johnston also injected energy and movement into her flowers, as seen here, where the flowers animatedly bend and stretch away from her hand-painted armoire. There it is. Upon closer examination, the white flowers and green stems incorporate deep shades of gray, darkening the purity of the colors and providing dynamic lyricism. Although she was praised for her organic approach to the subject, she didn't hesitate to contrast the natural with the abstract. In this work, delicate pink flowers stand in contrast to a bold and blocky background. The leaves have been scratched to show veining, giving the plant expressive vitality. Throughout her career, but especially around the beginning of the 1950s, it was Johnston's flowers that gained her the greatest number of commissions. This included design for the cover of Maclean's, where vibrant potted flowers overlap and float in this blue abyss. She was also asked to create a set of prints for rooms in the newly built Queen Elizabeth Hotel in Montreal, now a Fairmont Hotel, and it opened in 1958. And a series of Canadian wildflower studies for Murray's restaurant menu covers in the 1950s. As well as a coral-shaded Centennial Rose for Expo 67, commissioned by Reader's Digest. The 1950s also saw the release of two very important articles. The first was an article called At Home with an Artist, printed in Mayfair, where Frances-Anne Johnston, or Mrs. Franklin Arbuckle, as it states at the top of the page, is the author. She was asked to write about what it was like living with an artist. But instead, she decided to outline the history of her own family in addition to that of her husband, stating firmly that she was an artist too. And as an aside, I wanted to show you a few advertisements that surrounded this lengthy article, which seemed to reinforce gender roles and stereotypes of the time. So the other article from the 1950s was the Franklin Arbuckles, which was written by Barbara Moon for Maclean's magazine. The family actually had a connection to Maclean's, as Franklin, a freelance illustrator, had designed over 100 of their covers. Here's just some here. So in the mid-1960s, after a move from Montreal to Toronto, they finally moved into a home which had 2 studios. And Frances-Anne Johnston finally got her first dedicated studio space, 30 years after she had begun painting. Here is a picture of that studio, and you can see that she's still continuing to bring in flowers and plants into her home. And with the studio, her art production grew. So shortly after, she had her first major solo show at Robert's Gallery, which displayed over 70 paintings that had been produced over the course of a single year. And she painted her studio many times, as seen in this work here, where a monstera plant is leaning towards the large windows. The title of this work, Etude, is inscribed on the cover of a green book. It refers to the setting as well as to her studious approach to painting. As one of her larger canvases, it brings together her preferred motifs, from doors and windows, flowers, plants, to still lifes of household objects. As Ottawa art critic Kathleen Walker observed about this work, quote, "The viewer lives the room, feels at home in its magnificent clutter, and recognizes the artist's gutsy approach to the canvas," end quote. Accordingly, this work can be described as a self-portrait of Johnston's artistic pursuits. For me, it was such a critical moment in her practice that in the exhibition space, I decided to recreate it using artifacts from her original studio. So this includes her printing press, her easel and paintbrushes, the antique Madonna that you see in the background, assorted glass bottles in the window, which she would pull off for various still life arrangements, her black pedestal bowl, or it's kind of bluish. Anyway, a monstera plant, an original piece of fabric that appears in many of her paintings, as I was talking about before, and it's a rug, as you can see in this work. A reproduction of the Matisse-inspired fabric, there it is again. The painting in progress that was on the easel, and of course, her favorite white jug. So by the time she gets her own studio, she had already developed a very unique style of painting that had grown out of the limits of quick setups and teardowns, and the ephemerality of flowers and still life subjects. So she continues with this work, though her fabric backdrops started to expand after she gets her own studio to include a series of studio corners where patterned rugs and cushions on the floor, or perhaps her large windows in the background, stand in for a much larger stage and backdrop. And while French door in the studio was painted after she gets her own space, the close framing of the objects, the patterned tablecloth, and the somewhat abstracted background are still maintained. The objects in the foreground take the spotlight, and while the title points to the importance of the setting and the open door behind, though. So here, Johnston flattens the picture plane with striations to express the movement of light and shadow throughout the day, with contrasting bands of color. So this feminist take on Cubist concepts could be, I have a couple of theories, a comment on the slices of time she found to paint throughout the day as a working homemaker. However, it could also be a celebration of her new studio space, where she was able to finally leave arrangements out for longer periods of time instead of quickly painting them on the kitchen table before the next meal. So in the mid-1960s, her children were also grown, so she gets her studios just as her children are leaving the house. But in addition to having a studio, she's now able to pick up landscape painting a little bit again. So starting in the 1970s, they traveled to Florence, Italy, several times. And in 1974, Franklin Arbuckle starts the Ontario College of Art program abroad. It's a program that still exists today in Italy. They also spent their summers together traveling in a motor camper and painting landscapes across the country, including New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Alberta, and British Columbia. So it's at this point in time, when she's able to get back out a little bit again, that she starts producing work like this. And if you remember, this is from Brenda Firestone's donation. So finally, I was able to put them in context. A reviewer of her 1967 Roberts Gallery exhibition remarked, quote, "She's included a small number of landscapes, but these are only successful when she has the small, crowded quality of her interiors," end quote. So throughout her lifetime, she found beauty and intellectual rigor in applying different formal approaches to familiar subjects every day. And until she was able to get her own proper studio space, she was persistent in making as much room as possible for the development of her practice. Her home was a welcoming space where she hosted, relaxed with family, gardened, but also conducted serious independent work. This was mirrored in her paintings, where she conflated her domestic life, personal interest, and formal experimentation, confidently crafting an identity that balanced the various facets of herself. Thank you very much. So Alex and I are going to do a bit of a Q&A, and then we'll open it up afterwards to the audience for questions.
Thank you, Rebecca. Merci. That was wonderful. I love the Firestone chat format because as much as we learn about art history and about specific artworks, we get to also get a real sense of the story behind the art as well. And so I want to start there, art detective. What was it like to go on this journey, to do this research? Because again, when we received that donation from Brenda Firestone, I don't think I understood we were going to go in the direction that you went with the exhibitions. So that must have been quite revealing to see this whole nother side to Frances-Anne's work. Tell us about it.
Yeah, it was quite a journey. I do see it as one of my jobs to recover stories of women artists in history. And when I was doing the research and literally nothing came up, we do have a monograph that accompanies the exhibition on her work. And I thought that was extremely important because nothing has been written about her. So the process of research was primary research. I'm looking through articles. I don't have diaries, so that article she wrote for Mayfair was where I really got her voice and her personality sort of came through. But it was really a lot of art detective work. I was looking in a lot of the men's files because, of course, the files in the archives, you got Franz Johnston, Franklin Arbuckle, and then Frances-Anne Johnston, right? So in order to find clues about her, I'd look for her name in their files. Naming was a big issue as well. Is she Frances-Anne Johnston? Is she Frances-Anne Arbuckle? Frances Arbuckle. Her name was spelt wrong in a lot of archives because no one really knows about her. Francis sometimes. And what I didn't say in my presentation was that she always signed her paintings as Frances-Anne Johnston. And the reason she did that was because she said, I was an artist before I got married. So in her personal life, she was Frances Arbuckle. And so when I would do searches, and let's say there was a search bar, I would put in all forms of combinations so that I could uncover whatever I could. But certainly it was an art detective process. And as you could see from my presentation, looking at the works themselves, that's where her voice comes out, in my opinion, too. And that's a really good place to start.
So tell me about that voice. As a curator, do you think you know her?
Well, yes, in a way, I do. It's impossible to recover a person who's no longer with us fully, right? So I did a lot of interviews with the family. That's another way to get that information. But of course, we all know what we think of our own family members, right? It's always clouded, you see them in a very particular way. So what I have to do as a curator is take little bits from here, little bits from there, the archives, what people said about her, put it all together to create a picture. And then, of course, I'm putting my own layer on things, too. I adore her now. I'm very biased, but I have to sort of figure out how to muddle through all of that in order to come up with a picture for audiences and visitors.
Exactly, because what I think we're seeing through your lecture and through the exhibition and through the publication is a fairly strong voice, somebody who's really trying to navigate and break through a lot of bias. And that one sketch of her doing her painting, I felt like she's channeling Emily Carr to some degree, who was obviously a pioneer for many women artists. And you spoke about that feminist lens quite often in the lecture. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. So within the exhibition space, the feminist lens, I think, comes in through the exhibition design, first of all. I'm really bringing you into the interior, into her home, into her space. I'm bringing the men into her space. So often we have these group of 7 exhibitions where big, wide open landscape feels, right? But no, this is like crowded. This was a more is more exhibition. It's very crowded, just like her home would have been. I'm also using a feminist lens on the work of the men in the exhibition, because I could have shown way more landscapes by Franz Johnston, for instance, that we're all familiar and we all love. But instead, I chose most of the money for him to go towards that mural to show, look, there's a whole other side to his practice. Let's use a feminist lens to look at his practice in a different way. Same with illustration and Arbuckle. Illustration isn't talked about a lot as an art form. It's seen sort of as less of an art form. And so looking at history with this lens is really important. And certainly, I had a visitor come through while I was giving a tour, and they said, this exhibition is unapologetically feminine. And I said, thank you. That's exactly what I wanted.
And Rebecca, I remember you talking to Catherine Sinclair, our Deputy Director and Chief Curator, about bringing that Mayfair article into the publication. Tell me why that was so important.
Because it's the only article I have with her voice in, or any piece of writing that I have from her and her voice. It was so important to me. So the exhibition catalog, it's my essay on a lot of the aesthetics and a lot of the stuff I talked about today. Then scholar Catherine Maston, who wrote about her specialty is artist couples. And so her voice in, and then I wanted to bring in the voice of the artist too. So putting that in the monograph, which I hope future researchers and scholars now have something, unlike I didn't have anything, but now they have something to go back to, and they can look at her voice as well as part of that discussion. Because like we were saying, how do you recover someone? Well, I want you to also hear from her as well as from me.
Right, that seems pretty fundamental.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm going slightly off script, but I want to pick up on the artist couple bit. Tell me what you think that relationship was like.
Mm-hmm. So we did talk with the daughters quite a bit, and they said certainly they loved each other, they critiqued each other's work, there was a lot of love and professionalism between them. It's just that the society of the time, here's the thing, they both sacrificed. I was reading one of the articles and they said, 2 artists, they should never get married, and if they do, they should never have children. And they're like, but what kind of life would that be? And so Franklin's sacrifice, he wanted to be a landscape painter, and his sacrifice was doing the illustrations for McLean's to sort of bring in that regular income. So he sacrificed too. She sacrificed by staying at home. The level of sacrifice between them, let's just be honest, not the same, right? And that's a reflection of the time in which they were living. The expectations of women to stay at home and motherhood and everything. But certainly, they admired each other's work, and there was a lot of love there in that family.
Coming back to the Royal Academy work, and her referencing, that early publication and perhaps the length of the time that she's been working. Tell me about her practice. Like, how productive was she? What were her productive years?
Right. So I get that question a lot. When she gets her studio, and of course I said, her production increases. That's also because her children are now grown up. But as part of the exhibition catalog, I created an exhibition history at the back of the book. And the reason I did that was to prove that she was always making work and always exhibiting. There wasn't a time in her life where it sort of made a dip or anything. And she was so prodigious. She started with that 1931 work that I showed, and she just kept going. She was part of the RCA, the Ontario Society of Artists. She had several other exhibitions and opportunities, and she worked really hard, And so I will also say that her 2 children were about 12 years apart. And so I have to wonder, I didn't ask the daughters this question, but I have to wonder if that was her way of balancing it all so that she could continue to work while bringing up her children.
Right. It makes a lot of sense. Yeah, exactly. So let's come back to the exhibition design. You had mentioned it earlier. Why did you go in that direction? You said that it was very full, very purposefully full. What do you mean by that?
Full of stuff, yeah. Catherine, actually, in my upcoming exhibition, she's like, I'm going to challenge you to do a little less loans. There are over 21 lenders for this exhibition. And yeah, it's very full of stuff. And I feel like the warmth of the wood, like the exhibition design was so important for this show. And the warmth of the colors, that pink, there was a reviewer who said, who joked quite a bit for a couple paragraphs about how she loves her pinks. And so we color matched to the artworks. Franz Johnston loved his purples, and so his mural is against that purple. But I did want you to feel sort of surrounded and warm in the space.
Yeah, it has an interior space. It's obviously an exhibition space, but there is, as you said, sort of a sense of scale that reminds one of the home.
Yeah.
The warmth of material, which is not an easy thing to evoke in a big exhibition space. That's for sure. And so you're taking it on tour. Is that exhibition design going to change?
It will adapt for the upcoming venues a little bit, but not too much. The sort of that same sense I want to sort of evoke. So the next venue is the Riverbrink Art Museum in Niagara. And if you're familiar with that museum, it's just a giant historic house with actual fireplaces. So I think it's kind of perfect. And they were saying, oh, do you want us to move around some of our furniture, put it in storage? I was like, no, keep it. Like, this is amazing. And then it goes to the Judith and Norman Alex Art Gallery in Sarnia after that, which is a similar space to ours and will sort of incorporate a lot of the same techniques to get the same feel.
Okay, so now we have the opportunity to ask some questions of all of you. So, what are your burning thoughts? What do you need to know? Anyways, you can put up your hand. Yes.
Mm. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'll just say, too, that before I answer that, the insurance values for, let's say, the exhibition, her versus Franklin versus Franz, her work is still going for very comparable to what it was when she was selling it, which is so sad. So and it's because people didn't know about her. So
we're going to change that.
I know. Hopefully this exhibition changes that and her work is valued a little higher. But yeah, so her, I searched a lot for other women that she would have been talking with at the time. And again, because the research was so scant, I couldn't find much. There was an artist in Montreal who was part of an artist couple. Charles Fainmail was her husband, who was a sculptor, and her name was Marguerite Fainmail. And so they exchanged letters. But the artists that I brought in were my observations. She did have, she was part of the RCA, so she did, she knew people like Doris McCarthy. She had an exhibition with Molly Lambeau back, so she knew her. She had another exhibition with Ethel Steeth and Mabel Lockerbie from the Beaver Hall group. And so she knew people. But I didn't find, anything substantial there. At the Ontario College of Art, Marion Nicol was one of her contemporary students. But yeah, a lot of the observations were just of women of the time to her, and I was looking at their work in comparison to her.
We have done a couple of shows that include Ghitta Caiserman Roth's work, and that look at the interior, the use of windows, as you pointed out, the textile. It's just so striking that that's a trope that's being used by women at that time.
Definitely. I incorporated Ghitta Caiserman's work in a show here called Eclectic Geometric a little while ago. And I brought out this big textile and I rumpled it up because Ghitta Caiserman loved to show all the rumples in the fabric, just like Frances-Anne. And I had a lot of visitors like pull it taut. I'm like, no, it's supposed to be rumpled. They're like, someone touched this. I'm like, no, it's supposed to be rumpled. That beauty in the fabric and the, and definitely they were both looking at that as a theme.
And as you said, as the absent body in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, there were about 21 different lenders for the show. And largely, why that number is so large is because a lot of institutional collections only have like one of her work. And it's never really been contextualized before. So for me to ask to loan it and put it with the other work was a really big deal, and I think a lot of the institutions were happy. And then, of course, on the flip side of that, a lot of her work is in private collections. So that was part of the art detective work, is to figure out where some of this work is and who was collecting it. And it wasn't necessarily one big collector or anything. I did a presentation at the Canadian Women Artists Initiative, Kwahi, conference. And after I did that paper, I presented that paper, I had someone come up to me and say, hey, I have a Frances-Anne, like, didn't know anything about it. So, those kind of connections come up, but I guess your question is, certainly I'm not quite sure if there was any one particular person. It's out there, it comes up for auction quite a bit, and people are still buying it. It's a good price, but people don't really know anything about it.
The family obviously has a lot of the work, and it was so adorable at our opening. We had, I guess it was the great-grandchild, was so thrilled that a work that hangs in his bedroom was ending up in the exhibition, so that's kind of interesting. Barbara, you had a question.
Mm. Oh, yeah. Yep. But I got it's called a MAP grant, the Museums Assistant Program, and it's with Canadian Heritage. So Canadian Heritage did understand the value of recovering this really important information, and so they were able to give us a substantial sum for going a little bit overboard with the exhibition design, and then also for the tour itself. So conserving those panels, like, they were able to come on board, so it was excellent. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Anyone else? Any final burning questions? Yes and yes. Okay, got two more.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Oof. Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah. It's a really good question, and I didn't sort of get in depth with their daughters about that. Only that they told me that they would often go into each other's. Well, Francis would go to his studio, and he would come home, and wherever she had set up, that they would critique each other's work and say, maybe if you do it this way or that way, and they talk a lot about art. There's a very unfortunate quote, actually, because the daughter said this isn't exactly how he felt, but there's an unfortunate quote in the one of the articles I showed, the Franklin Arbuckles, where he says something like, well, Frances was born with it or something. She's a much better painter than I am, but, I'm bringing in the money for the family. So obviously he really respected her. I think the born with it comment is playing into that essentialism that I was talking about before and that gender bias. But I talked to the daughters about that quote, and they said, no, he genuinely, knew that she worked really hard, and he respected her in her work. So, sorry I don't have any more details there, but they did respect each other for sure, and encouraged each other, yeah.
Well, listen, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rebecca, for the exhibition, the publication, which is on sale in our gallery shop on the first floor, by the way. Please do check out the show. This is the final day. And please do go to the Firestone Gallery, too, to see our 2 new exhibitions that are open. Thank you again, Rebecca. Thanks to all of you for spending the afternoon with us. We so appreciate it. Have a wonderful day. Take care, everyone.